Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. Today, we are going to take a look at magic. No, we're not going to talk about how to actually do magic, but we are going to talk about words that have something to do with magical people or practices. We're going to look at where these come from and dig into some of the really fascinating history that is behind some of these words. One question we're going to answer is, what is magic? Again, I don't mean that I'm going to tell you what magic, the act, really is, but we're going to take a look at the etymology and look at the history. What about wizards? Where does this word come from? What does it ultimately mean? How about witches? How about spells? How about enchantments? And how about all of those nonsense words like abracadabra and hocus pocus? Okay, clearly these come from somewhere, so let's talk about where they come from. Let's start with magic, which is one of the most interesting words. Now, most cultures throughout the world have something that people today would call magic, but what you might not know is that this particular word and this particular concept comes from a very particular historical moment that occurred in one place, in one time, where a certain group of people invented this word and have spread it all over the world ultimately because they have been that influential. That particular place and time was the 5th century BC, and there was a lot going on in what we would today call Southeastern Europe and the Middle East in the 5th century BC. The Persian Empire was at its zenith. It was controlling everything around what we today call the Middle East, from Egypt to Turkey to Iraq and Iran, and all the way over to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even parts of India. This was the probably the biggest empire that the world had ever seen geographically and possibly even population wise at this point in history. Like most empires, it was constantly looking to expand, and around 480 BC, it set its sights on little old Greece. You can see Greece over there in the green on the far left side of the screen. So they decided they were going to invade Greece, and Greece was not very happy about this. And if you've seen the movie 300, you've seen a modern dramatization of the invasion that occurred when King Xerxes took his giant army and his giant navy over to deal with little old Greece. You know that this did not work, whether you've seen the movie 300 and the dramatization that occurs there, or if you've read the original story as written by the Greek historian Herodotus about 40 years after this invasion, you know what happened, okay? But we're not going to dwell too much on that. Rather, we're going to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the Greeks when all of this was happening. So even though the invasion didn't work, the Persians still were there at the doorstep of the Greeks for well over 100 years after this invasion. And if you were a Greek person during this time period, you probably had a mixture of revulsion and fascination for the Persians. Revulsion, because of course this was a huge, powerful, dangerous empire that was right on your doorstep that had tried to invade you, and you never knew when they were going to try to invade you again and subjugate you and incorporate you into their imperialistic nation. On the other hand, you were fascinated by them because, as with any big empire, you knew that they had a lot of power, you knew that they had a lot of knowledge, and there was a lot going on there that you might be interested in. So we know that a lot of Greeks would go over to the Persian Empire, and after the years of the invasion, there were semi-good relations between the Greek states and the Persians. So the Greeks were interested by the Persians, but also kind of scared of them, understandably, at the same time. One of the things that the Greeks came to understand about the Persians is that they had a particular religious system, which shouldn't surprise you because everybody back then, every nation, every country had its own particular religious system. And so the Persians believed in a religion called Zoroastrianism, which you don't need to know too much about to understand what we're talking about here. But the Zoroastrians and the Persians had a priesthood. Again, not very surprising. Most cultures, most empires had some kind of priesthood that where the priests would be responsible for dealing with God or the gods. Okay, in Persian, the a priest was called a magush. Magush was the Persian word for priest. Now, Herodotus, that same historian I mentioned earlier, tells us some things about what these priests would do. And honestly, even though he thinks they're a little bit weird from the Greek perspective, they don't seem to be too weird from a macro perspective, okay? From the perspective of somebody who's studying religious studies and studying different religions and cultures from around the world, they do a lot of normal priest stuff, okay? They sacrifice to the gods, they pour libations to the gods, which is basically some kind of liquid offering, of something like wine or milk or oil. They have burial rituals, so they have something to do with burying the dead and making sure you have a good afterlife or something like that, okay? And they do a bunch of other stuff too, but they seem to just be pretty normal priests when it comes to comparing them to other priests from other countries and other cultures all over the world, okay? And again, the Persians called these people magush. Magush was their native Persian word. Interestingly, this word comes from an ancient Indo-European root, just meaning to be capable or powerful. So this word doesn't really mean anything that interesting. It really just means somebody who is capable or powerful, okay? The Persians were an Indo-European people. They descended from these tribes that we call the Indo-Europeans who lived about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, okay? Interestingly, the Greeks are also descended from them. The Romans were also descended from them. And we, English speakers, are also descended from them. So we have some words in English that are cognate with this word. In other words, they descend from the same root because ultimately we descend from the same language that the Persians did. So that's pretty cool, okay? So our word might comes from this same Indo-European root that means to be capable or powerful because, of course, as a noun, might means power, right? If you have might, if you're mighty, you're powerful. And as a verb, if you might do something, it means you have the power to do something. You're capable of doing something, okay? And interestingly, our verb may, as in I may do something, also comes from the same root as might and as magush. Okay, so that's what that Indo-European root ultimately means. Now, these people ultimately got borrowed into Greek and Latin as a particular kind of people, and you might better know them as magi. All right, you have probably heard the story of the three wise men showing up at the birth of Jesus or shortly thereafter from the New Testament, and you might remember from the story that these three wise men, who are called magoi in the original Greek, and magi is just a Latinization of magoi. Either way, their name comes from the Persian magush, okay? And where do they come from in the story? They come from the east, okay? They come from somewhere around Babylon or Persia because they are these kind of people. At least that's who they're portrayed as being in the New Testament, okay? And you can see that they're mysterious but powerful when they get portrayed in the New Testament. So you know these people. You have heard of these people, even if you didn't know that you had heard of these Persian priests. There they were the whole time in the Christmas story, okay? So the Greeks found out about these Persian priests because, again, they were fascinated by everything Persian, even if they were a little bit scared by it or put off by it, all right? And so they borrowed this word into Greek. All right, and they decide to do something with it, and they take this word and they make it into a new Greek word, which is magake. Okay, magake was originally an adjective that meant anything having to do with the magush, with the magi, okay? But it comes to be a noun in its own right as anything that is related to the supernatural realm, but with a caveat, okay? And that caveat is that it's not something that the speaker thinks is necessarily normal for their particular culture or their particular reference point of what they think is normal, all right? So Greeks started using this word magike, which they totally just got from the Persian word magush, that's all it really is, okay? To mean things that are maybe powerful, where people try to get in touch with the invisible, unseen, spiritual, supernatural realm, but they're doing it in ways that maybe our culture thinks is a little bit weird. And notice I'm saying our culture kind of in scare quotes to mean anybody can say this, okay? But specifically, this particular word comes from the Greeks, okay? The Greeks were in this particular historical position where they were next to this big, powerful, scary empire, and they were fascinated by it, and they learned stuff about it, and they came up with words to describe some of the religious practices of that empire, all right? So to the Greeks, the Persians were weird because they weren't the Persians, probably just like the Persians thought the Greeks were weird, okay? So they came up with this word to basically say anything you do that has something to do with the supernatural realm that's weird. And thus was born our term magic. Our term magic comes from the Latin word, which was just the Greek borrowing of this word. So the Greeks literally invented the word and sort of the concept behind magic here in the 5th century BC. Okay, and this is really the beginning of our modern divide between religion and magic. Okay, for the Greeks, religion, although they didn't really have that word either, and that's a whole another topic. But for the Greeks, what we would call religion would be anything that they did. Okay, the Greeks thought that they were normal because most cultures throughout history have been self-centered like that. So the Greeks thought that they were normal, and they thought that their particular spiritual practices were standard, and that everybody else's were weird. Okay, and that's where our modern divide between religion and magic comes from ultimately. All right, so all of our terms that have to do with magic ultimately descend from this particular historical moment. Let's talk about specific kinds of magic, specific words that might have something to do with magic and where these terms come from. The interesting thing about most of these terms is that they didn't originally mean anything particularly quote unquote magical. Okay, they started off as pretty banal terms that that essentially just meant something that could be magical, could be a little more normal, okay? But they came to acquire magical overtones as the years went on, all right? Incantations and enchantments are a great example of this process, where a word originally meant something that was kind of boring, and then ultimately might evolve into something that means something more overtly magical, as we would describe it. Incantation comes from Latin, all right? And you can break this up if you know Latin into in and cant, okay? And the ation part is just a noun ending in Latin that you don't need to worry about, but of course we get our shun ending from that as well, all right? So the root cant, C-A-N-T, in Latin meant to sing, okay? And the preposition slash preverb in Latin could mean in, it could mean into, it could mean onto, but in a hostile sense, it could mean against, okay? So an incantation originally just meant when you're doing some kind of song or chant or something like that against somebody, okay? Or onto somebody or at somebody, okay, or even into somebody if you kind of want to think of it that way, all right? And the French version of this word is enchantment, okay? Incantation and enchantment are the same word. French is a daughter of Latin, which means that it evolved from Latin, and as it evolved, it underwent some sound changes, even though you can still see that these words are related to each other just by looking at them, okay? In Latin became en in French, so they just changed the vowel, and then the root cant in Latin became chant in French, okay? And this is where we get our word chant from, by the way. So our English word chant also comes from this cant root in Latin, okay? And you can probably think of some other words that come from it. So an incantation and an enchantment are literally the same word, okay? They have the same root, and they both ultimately come from this Latin word, and they really basically mean the same thing. The original idea of being enchanted is that it's like somebody has sung or chanted something at you or onto you or against you, which has caused you to feel a certain way. Obviously, we use the term enchantment in more of a metaphorical sense today, but this is the original meaning. It comes from incantation, which in turn originally just meant somebody chanting or singing something toward you to try to affect you. Okay, let's talk about another magical root. Okay, what about potion? Potion comes from another Latin root that literally just means to drink. That pot root literally just means to drink. So a potion has that same noun ending that we saw in incantation. So originally a potion just meant a drink. How boring is that? It could be anything that you drank, and that was a potion. It comes from this Latin root pot, all right? Other words we get from this are potable. You may have heard of potable water, for instance. Potable just means drinkable, okay? So we also get that from this Latin root. So this is another great example of a word that originally meant something pretty boring and then became more magical as the years went on, to the point where you probably wouldn't call your glass of milk a potion, right? People would look at you weird if you did, but originally that is what the word potion meant. How about spells? This is another word that originally didn't mean anything very exciting and has come to mean something that sounds more magical. It actually comes from an Old English word, so this is not a Latin or a Greek root like what we've been looking at so far, but it comes from an Old English word that just meant to speak as a verb or as a noun. It meant something spoken or narrated. So how boring is that, right? So a spell was originally just something that you uttered, something that you said, okay? And it could be anything, however banal, boring, or unmagical it was. And then ultimately, this word came to mean something that was specifically more magic sounding, all right? You may know of another word that has spell in it, but you would probably never make the connection, but now you will. And that is gospel. Okay, you've probably heard of the gospel, but you may not know that gospel comes from two Old English words that mean good. The go part comes from good, and it's still our same good word today, so that hasn't changed. Okay, and the spell part means what I just told you it meant: narrative, story, news, something people say. So the Godspell in Old English was literally just the good news. That's all that was. And so gospel today literally just means good news, okay? The gospels are obviously the biographies of Jesus in the New Testament that tell the good news about Jesus. But notice that it's not the good spell about Jesus, okay? I don't think that when they called them the gospels, they were trying to say that Jesus was a magician, although some people in antiquity certainly thought he was a magician when they heard about him. But they were just trying to say it's the good news. So you can see this spell word was a very normal, boring word that didn't necessarily have anything to do with magic in the Old English period. What about wizards? This is yet another root that originally didn't necessarily mean anything magical. It comes from another Old English root, which was wit or wis, and this root meant knowledge. There were a lot of words in Old English that had something to do with wit or wis that meant knowledge. So a wizard was originally just somebody who knows a lot. Okay, and then it came to mean somebody who knows a lot and can therefore perform magical acts or something like that. All right, we still have the word wit today in English. Today it means like humor, but you can see how that word would have evolved from something that meant knowledge, because a lot of times there's a connection between intelligence and sense of humor. We also have the word witless, okay, which maintains that original meaning a little bit better, where if you're witless, you're dumb, right? You don't have knowledge. You are without knowledge. You are witless, okay? So you can still see that root there in that word. What about witches? This one is actually a little bit harder. We're not 100% sure what root this comes from, although we do know it comes from the Old English word Wicca, which meant something like sorcerer, and there was both a masculine and a feminine version of that in Old English, even though today witch has come to be, over the intervening years, much more of a standard feminine term than a masculine term, right? Although you may have heard of Wiccans, who got their name from this Old English word, and of course they use it in more of a gender neutral way like it was originally used in Old English, okay? Where does this come from originally? Again, there are several theories and we're not 100% sure, but our best guess is that this word is related to a Germanic root that meant divine or holy or something like that, and the idea would have been that these would have been people who had a special connection with God or with the gods or with spiritual powers of some kind. And then it came to be a little darker, where it's people who are maybe on the margins of society who have a special connection to the spiritual realm. And then later, the specific feminine meaning of the word witch evolved out of that. Finally, let's wrap this up with talking about some of these magic words, okay? Now, these are often difficult to trace, and it's probably not surprising because they're kind of nonsense words. You look at them and, they sound like they rhyme, they sound cool, but they don't necessarily come from any specific Greek or Latin roots that you can tell. So I should preface this discussion here at the end by saying that what we're going to talk about is unclear. Okay, these are our best guesses as to where a couple of these words come from, but I'm going to give them to you anyways. Okay, one thing I do want to tell you that I do know for sure, so we don't have to guess about this part, is that in magical spells from the Greco-Roman era, 2,000 years ago or so, they love to use foreign words, and a lot of the foreign words that they would like to use would be names of gods in other languages, okay? Obviously, the Greeks and the Romans were living in a very polytheistic world. All the different cultures had a bunch of different gods that they believed in. And so even if you weren't from a particular culture, you might believe that another culture had gods that had real power. And so you might try to call on those gods and sort of harness their power for yourself, even if you normally weren't a worshiper of that particular god from that particular culture. So there's a good guess to be made that a lot of these magic words that ultimately sound like nonsense originally started out as names of gods in other languages, okay? Which explains why they may not mean anything to somebody who is uttering them, because to them they sound like nonsense words because they're names from some other language originally, okay? Abracadabra is one of the most famous sets of magic words. And our best guess as to where abracadabra comes from is exactly what I was just telling you, okay? It may come from what was originally a god of probably Egypt, okay? Now, Egypt was part of the Roman Empire, so Egypt was not a foreign land if you were in the Roman Empire, but there was still a lot of knowledge and ancient wisdom coming out of Egypt because their culture was so old, okay? So if you were a Greek or a Roman, even though Egypt wasn't foreign, quote unquote, to you from a political standpoint, it might be foreign culturally, and Greeks and Romans had a lot of respect for the ancient knowledge that would come out of Egypt, okay? Of course, there's kind of a unique pantheon of gods that the Egyptians believed in, and according to some ancient accounts, one of those gods was named Abraxas, or Abrasax, okay? We find that ancient god in both forms, all right? And there's a decent chance that our word abracadabra, which is how it would have originally been pronounced, was kind of a bastardization of this Egyptian god's name. Again, I wouldn't be dogmatic about that. There are other theories that abracadabra could come from a Hebrew or an Aramaic phrase, which is definitely not out of the question, because we know that some Greek and Latin speakers would borrow Hebrew or Aramaic words to use in their spells. So I think we have to keep that possibility open too. But for my money, the best guess is that it comes from this ancient god named Abraxas or Abrasax. What about hocus pocus? Okay, this is probably our second most famous magic word that doesn't make any sense after abracadabra. Again, we're not 100% sure where this comes from, but our best guess is, again, this is a bastardization of something that people heard in another language or from another culture that they didn't understand, and they maybe repeated it a little bit wrong, and they messed it up a little bit, but they thought that it sounded like magic words, okay? So our best guess is that this actually comes from the Latin Mass in Catholic Christianity, okay, where they might say something like hoc est corpum, which is Latin for this is the body, all right? Now, if you don't know Latin, you don't know what they're saying, but you know something, quote unquote, magical is happening because they might hold up the bread. And of course, Catholics believe that that bread actually undergoes transubstantiation, which sounds pretty magical in some ways, right? So it's quite possible that hocus pocus comes from a bastardization or a mangling of this Latin phrase, hoc est corpum. Again, I would not say that I'm sure of that at all, but that is our best theory that we have based on all the evidence that we have. Okay, that finishes our excursion for today. What other magic words can you think of? What else would you like to know the etymology of? Go ahead and comment below, and I will respond to all of your comments. Hope you've enjoyed this safari. See you next time.